In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world lies wrapped in silence, there exists a sacred threshold between earth and heaven. If this journey speaks to your heart, subscribe, leave a like, and share in the comments. What is God calling you to learn today? Tell me where you're watching from. Let's walk together. Now, in these moments of solitude, Ellen White discovered something that would reshape her understanding of divine communion forever. She wrote of a power so profound, so accessible, yet so often neglected that entire destinies pivot upon its practice. In the pages of early writings, she unveils prayer not as religious routine, but as the very breath of the soul, a direct line of communication with the infinite God who bends his ear to catch the faintest whisper of a seeking heart. Consider the woman who knelt in her modest home, surrounded by the weight of impossible circumstances. Bills unpaid, children sick, hope wearing thin like fabric stretched too far. Yet in that darkened room, as she lifted her voice in simple, desperate honesty, something extraordinary occurred. The atmosphere shifted, not because her problems vanished, but because she had touched the eternal. White observed this phenomenon repeatedly, ordinary people accessing supernatural power through the simple act of prayer. She saw farmers whose failing crops revived after earnest supplication. She witnessed mothers whose troubled children experienced inexplicable transformation following hours of intercession. She documented healings that defied medical explanation, all connected to persistent, faithful prayer. But this power came with conditions. White emphasized that prayer must flow from a heart aligned with God's will, cleansed from cherished sin, and motivated by love rather than selfish ambition. She warned against approaching the throne of grace with harbored resentment, knowing that unforgiveness creates a barrier between the petitioner and the divine response. The secret, she discovered, lay not in eloquent words or lengthy supplications, but in the quality of surrender. When the praying soul relinquishes control, when pride bows before infinite wisdom, when human plans yield to divine purpose, then heaven's resources become available to earth's greatest needs. White wrote of moments when she felt the very presence of Christ drawing near during prayer, when time seemed suspended and eternity touched the temporal. These were not mystical experiences reserved for the spiritually elite, but encounters available to every sincere seeker willing to approach God with childlike faith and genuine repentance. Yet she also witnessed the tragedy of unanswered prayers, not because God was unwilling to respond, but because the petitioners harbored secret sins, nursed bitter grudges, or demanded their own way rather than seeking divine wisdom. Prayer, she learned, requires more than words. It demands transformation of character. As shadows lengthen across this present world, as confusion multiplies and human solutions prove inadequate, the power she described becomes not merely beneficial, but essential. For in prayer, the finite touches the infinite, and impossible circumstances bow before the one who spoke worlds into existence. Behind closed doors, away from public gaze and human approval, the true measure of spiritual life reveals itself. In the Testimonies for the Church, White drew back the curtain on what she called the secret place, that private sanctuary where souls commune with their Creator and emerge transformed by divine encounter. She tells of a minister whose public prayers moved congregations to tears, yet whose private prayer life had withered to mere formality. His eloquent petitions impressed listeners, but heaven remained unmoved because his heart had grown cold toward God. Meanwhile, in a humble cottage across town, an unlettered woman poured out her soul in halting words, and angels carried her simple requests directly to the throne of grace. This contrast illuminated a fundamental truth White emphasized throughout her writings. The power of prayer flows not from polished phrases, but from genuine hunger for God. She observed that many believers treat prayer like a spiritual duty to be discharged rather than a privilege to be treasured. They rush through hurried petitions, check prayer off their daily list, then wonder why their spiritual lives remain barren and their faith weak. White described the proper approach to prayer as entering a sacred audience chamber. She urged believers to prepare their hearts through confession, to quiet their minds from worldly distractions, and to approach God with the reverence due to one who holds all power, yet loves with infinite tenderness. This preparation, she noted, often proves more valuable than the petition itself. The hidden life of prayer, according to White, shapes character in ways that no public ministry or religious activity can achieve. In solitude with God, pride withers under divine scrutiny. Selfish ambitions dissolve in the light of eternal purposes. Bitter thoughts find healing in the warmth of divine love. The praying soul gradually conforms to the image of Christ through these repeated encounters with holiness. She wrote extensively about prayer as spiritual warfare, describing how earnest intercession drives back the forces of a darkness that seek to destroy human souls. Parents praying for wayward children, pastors interceding for struggling congregations, missionaries battling spiritual strongholds in foreign lands, all engaged in combat more real and significant than any earthly conflict. White emphasized that effective prayer requires persistence. She pointed to biblical examples of those who wrestled with God until receiving divine blessing, noting that heaven often tests the sincerity of human requests through delayed answers. The delay, she explained, serves not to discourage but to deepen dependence on God and strengthen faith muscles through exercise. In her personal experience, White discovered that prayer changed her more than it changed her circumstances. As she brought her fears, doubts, and burdens to God, she found peace replacing anxiety, wisdom illuminating confusion, and strength flowing into areas of weakness. The external challenges remained, but her capacity to handle them increased through divine reinforcement. The hidden prayer chamber, she concluded, becomes the powerhouse of Christian experience. From this secret place flows the strength for public service, the wisdom for difficult decisions, and the love that reaches out to others. Without this foundation, all religious activity becomes mere performance, impressive to observers but powerless to transform lives. Along the dusty roads of Palestine, a solitary figure often withdrew from the pressing crowds to seek communion with his Father. In The Desire of Ages, White unveils the prayer life of Christ as the supreme example of divine human communication, revealing how the Son of God himself depended upon these sacred conversations for strength, guidance, and renewal. Before every major decision, Christ prayed. Before selecting the 12 disciples who would carry his message to the world, he spent entire nights in solitude with the Father. Before facing the ultimate test of Calvary, he agonized in Gethsemane until his sweat became drops of blood. White observed that if the sinless Son of God required such intense communion with heaven, how much more do fallen humans need this lifeline of prayer? She wrote of watching Christ's prayer habits during her visionary experiences, noting how he rose before dawn to steal away to quiet places where human voices could not intrude upon divine conversation. Mountains, gardens, solitary shores, these became his prayer chambers where Earth's Redeemer renewed his connection with eternal purposes and drew strength for the day's ministry. What strikes White most profoundly is the intimacy Christ displayed in these private moments. Gone was the public formality of synagogue prayers. Instead, she witnessed a son speaking with his beloved Father, sharing burdens too heavy for human hearts, seeking wisdom beyond earthly understanding, and surrendering his will completely to divine plans that often made no sense from human perspective. The disciples, observing this pattern, eventually approached Christ with a request that would echo through centuries. "Lord, teach us to pray." They recognized something in his prayer life that their own religious training had failed to provide, a connection so real, so powerful, that it transformed not only circumstances but the very nature of the one praying. White emphasizes that Christ's prayers were not merely requests for divine assistance, but expressions of perfect trust in his Father's character. Even when facing betrayal, torture, and abandonment, Christ's prayers reflected unwavering confidence in divine love and wisdom. This trust, she noted, became the secret of his ability to forgive enemies, heal the broken, and maintain hope despite overwhelming opposition. The Garden of Gethsemane reveals prayer's ultimate purpose, according to White's analysis. There, Christ demonstrated that prayer's greatest power lies not in changing God's mind, but in aligning human will with divine purpose. Through agonizing honesty, "Let this cup pass from me," followed by complete surrender. "Nevertheless, not my will but yours be done." Christ modeled prayer as the pathway to perfect submission. White observed that Christ's prayer life bridged heaven and earth in ways that transformed both realms. Through his intercession, divine mercy found expression in human experience. Through his communion with the Father, heavenly wisdom illuminated earthly confusion. Through his persistent seeking, the barrier between finite and infinite dissolved. This same bridge remains available to every believing soul, White declares. The Christ who prayed for strength in Gethsemane now intercedes for struggling believers. The Son who communed with the Father in mountain solitude now invites burdened hearts to find rest in divine presence. The Savior who demonstrated prayer's power through his earthly ministry continues to teach seeking souls how to touch heaven through simple, trusting communication. For those who learn to pray as Christ prayed, with honesty, persistence, and complete surrender, the same transforming power that sustained the Son of God through his earthly mission becomes their inheritance and strength. Water has a peculiar property. It seeks the lowest places, flowing around obstacles, wearing away the hardest substances through persistent contact, eventually finding its way to the sea. In Selected Messages, White reveals prayer as possessing this same transformative persistence, gradually reshaping human character through repeated contact with divine holiness. She tells of a businessman whose harsh treatment of employees had earned him a reputation for cruelty throughout his community. Week after week, his wife knelt in their private chamber, praying for his heart to soften. No dramatic conversion occurred overnight. Instead, like water slowly wearing smooth the roughest stone, her persistent intercession began creating tiny changes in his behavior. A harsh word withheld here, a moment of patience shown there. Eventually, his employees noticed. His community wondered. His own heart began to recognize a transformation he could not explain. This illustrates what White calls the hidden work of prayer, the gradual purification of human nature that occurs when souls regularly expose themselves to divine influence. Just as water purifies by washing away contamination, prayer cleanses the heart by bringing it repeatedly into contact with perfect love, infinite wisdom, and absolute purity. White observed that many believers expect prayer to work like lightning, sudden, dramatic, immediately visible. Instead, she discovered prayer typically works like a spring rain, gentle, steady, soaking deep into the soil of human character until transformation becomes inevitable. The pride that once dominated begins yielding to humility. The anger that once exploded starts dissolving into forgiveness. The selfishness that once controlled gradually gives way to genuine concern for others. She documented countless examples of this character purification through prayer. Parents whose patience increased through intercession for difficult children. Pastors whose love deepened through prayer for challenging congregations. Individuals whose fears diminished through regular communion with divine peace. The transformation occurred not through human effort, but through divine influence flowing into receptive hearts. Prayer also serves as character diagnosis, White noted. In the presence of perfect holiness, hidden sins surface like impurities rising to water's surface when heated. Unconfessed wrongs become uncomfortable. Cherished resentments feel heavy. Secret pride grows unbearable. This discomfort, rather than driving souls away from prayer, should draw them closer to the one who can cleanse what they cannot purify themselves. White emphasized that prayer's purifying power requires honest self-examination. Superficial petitions that avoid heart issues accomplish little lasting change. But when believers bring their actual struggles, failures, and weaknesses into divine presence, when they pray with transparent honesty rather than religious pretense, then real transformation begins. The process demands patience, White warned. Character change through prayer resembles the formation of precious stones. Pressure applied consistently over time produces lasting beauty. Quick fixes and instant sanctification prove as illusory as expecting diamonds to form overnight. Instead, steady, persistent prayer gradually works divine nature into human experience. She also noted that prayer's character-transforming power extends beyond the one praying. Intercessory prayer often produces changes in others that human persuasion cannot achieve. Hearts that resist direct confrontation soften under the influence of earnest prayer. Relationships that seem hopelessly broken find healing through persistent intercession. Communities experience revival through the faithful prayers of a few dedicated souls. The secret lies in understanding prayer as partnership with divine power rather than mere human exercise. When believers align their requests with God's character-building purposes, when they seek holiness more than happiness, when they desire transformation more than temporary relief, then prayer becomes the channel through which heaven's purifying influence flows into earth's contaminated stream. In the spiritual harvest fields of human souls, where eternal destinies hang in the balance, White discovered prayer's most far-reaching power, its ability to move heaven on behalf of others. Through gospel workers, she reveals how intercessory prayer becomes the invisible force that prepares hearts for divine truth, opens doors that human effort cannot budge, and brings life where death once reigned. She tells of a missionary laboring in hostile territory where every sermon met cold indifference and every invitation fell on deaf ears. Months passed with no visible fruit. Discouragement crept in like autumn frost, threatening to kill hope itself. Yet across the ocean, unknown to this struggling evangelist, a group of believers had adopted his field as their special burden. Night after night, they gathered to intercede for souls they would never meet, pleading for divine breakthrough in circumstances they could barely imagine. Then came the harvest season. Hearts that had been stone hard suddenly opened like ripe grain ready for gathering. Individuals who had mocked divine truth began seeking earnestly for salvation. Community leaders who had opposed the gospel started attending meetings with genuine interest. The missionary witnessed transformation that his preaching alone could never have produced, not knowing that faithful prayers had been preparing the soil of human hearts for months. White observed this pattern repeatedly throughout her ministry, seemingly impossible evangelistic breakthroughs directly connected to persistent intercessory prayer. She documented cases where entire communities experienced spiritual awakening after prayer groups claimed those territories for God. She recorded instances where hostile opponents of truth became its strongest advocates, following intensive intercession on their behalf. Prayer, she discovered, operates in spiritual dimensions where human influence cannot reach. While missionaries can present truth and demonstrate love, only divine power can actually change hearts. Prayer invites this heavenly intervention, creating channels through which divine grace flows into human experience. The intercessor becomes a partner with God in the great work of soul rescue. White emphasized that effective intercessory prayer requires specific focus rather than general goodwill. Simply wishing people well accomplishes little. But when believers target particular individuals, study their needs, understand their obstacles to faith, and then bring these specific concerns before God with persistent urgency, then spiritual breakthrough becomes possible. She wrote extensively about prayer's role in opening what she called providential doors for gospel work. Opportunities that human planning could never arrange suddenly appear when God's people seek divine guidance through earnest supplication. Opposition melts away, resources become available, the right people appear at the right moments, circumstances align in ways that reveal divine orchestration rather than human coincidence. The harvest metaphor particularly appealed to White because it emphasized timing. Just as farmers must plant, cultivate, and gather crops during specific seasons, spiritual work requires sensitivity to divine timing. Prayer helps workers discern when hearts are ready for truth, when circumstances favor evangelistic effort, when the spiritual climate becomes favorable for divine seed to germinate and grow. White also noted that intercessory prayer protects gospel workers from spiritual attacks that seek to hinder the harvest. Missionaries operating in hostile environments often face opposition that extends beyond human resistance into supernatural warfare. Prayer creates protective barriers, provides supernatural strength, and ensures that heaven's resources remain available to those laboring in earth's most challenging fields. The multiplication effect of prayer particularly amazed White. One person's faithful intercession could influence dozens of others. A praying mother's influence extended far beyond her immediate family. A pastor's prayer burden for his community often resulted in transformation that affected generations. Through prayer, individual believers participate in God's worldwide harvest by claiming souls they may never meet until heaven reveals the full results of their faithful intercession. In the final courtroom of human history, where every secret motive faces divine scrutiny and every hidden prayer receives its eternal verdict, the true power of communion with God stands fully revealed. As White draws together the threads of this sacred subject, she presents prayer not merely as religious exercise, but as the determining factor in humanity's ultimate destiny. She envisions that great day when the books are opened and heaven's records display the true influence of human petitions. There, written in characters of light, appear the countless times when earnest prayer turned the tide of circumstances, when desperate intercession saved souls from destruction, when faithful supplication brought divine intervention into seemingly hopeless situations. The prayers that seemed unanswered find their complete fulfillment in ways that finite minds could never have imagined. White sees the praying remnant standing vindicated before the universe, their simple faith in divine power proving more valuable than all earthly wisdom and human achievement. Those who learn to touch heaven through believing prayer find themselves prepared for eternal communion with the God they learn to trust through earthly trials. Their characters, purified through years of honest prayer, shine with reflected divine glory. But the judgment also reveals prayer's tragic neglect. Opportunities missed because believers failed to seek divine guidance. Souls lost because no one interceded on their behalf. Churches that remained powerless because their members substituted religious activity for genuine communion with God. Communities that stayed unchanged because believers prayed little and worried much. The contrast becomes stark. Those who made prayer their vital breath versus those who treated it as occasional duty. Those who wrestled with God until receiving divine blessing versus those who offered hurried petitions and wondered why heaven seemed silent. Those who sought God's will above their own comfort versus those who demanded divine service for selfish purposes. Yet even in this final revelation, White sees divine mercy extending to those who genuinely sought God, despite their imperfect understanding. The widow's simple trust, the child's innocent faith, the struggling believer's halting words, all find their place in heaven's loving acceptance. God judges not the eloquence of prayers, but the sincerity of hearts that offered them. Looking back across the landscape of human history, White sees prayer as the golden thread connecting earth to heaven, time to eternity, human weakness to divine strength. Every genuine petition, regardless of how simple or stumbling, helped weave the fabric of divine purpose into human experience. Each moment of earnest communion added another note to the great symphony of redemption that began in Eden and culminates in the New Jerusalem. The power she witnessed and wrote about proves to be more than supernatural intervention in human affairs. Prayer's ultimate power lies in its ability to prepare finite beings for infinite fellowship, to tune earthly hearts for heavenly harmonies, to transform creatures of dust into companions of angels through the miracle of divine grace. As shadows lengthen toward that final day, White's message rings with urgent relevance. The power of prayer remains available to every seeking soul. The throne of grace still welcomes honest petitions. The God who answered faithful prayers throughout history continues to hear and respond to those who approach him with sincere hearts and humble faith. The question that began this journey finds its answer not in theological theory, but in practical experience. Prayer's power flows from the character of the God who hears, rather than the eloquence of those who speak. For those willing to learn this sacred art, heaven's resources remain freely available until earth's final prayer is offered and eternity's endless communion begins.